And we want to welcome you all to our kickoff event for Minneapolis chapter of America's Future Foundation. For those of you who had a chance to look at the website, we will have a link to that for our chapter soon, but the America's Future Foundation is an organization based in DC, and they're connected to the Heritage Foundation. It's an educational think tank promoting limited government, free market principles, and fiscal conservatism in general. The organization's been around for close to 15 years in Washington, but over the last few years, they've been branching out across the country and have chapters in Chicago, Denver, and I believe Phoenix. So when they were here in June doing a pre-convention panel speaker series, sort of similar to this, we talked to them, and this is Anna and Jason Lima, are also founding executive board members of the organization. My name is Heather Flannery, and we talked to them about starting a chapter in Minneapolis because we're involved in several different conservative organizations, as I'm sure many of you are here. I see lots of faces from lots of different organizations, and we share a common interest in reforming, getting back to the principles behind conservatism, which we seem to have forgotten over the past decade. And as many of you who are aware, whether you're Republicans, Libertarians, Conservatives, or possibly not even aligned at all to a political party or partisan formation, you're all here because you have an interest in some of the things that this organization stands for, and similar organizations of groups of people who are very concerned about where our country's headed right now and want to get back to the basic principles of what we believe in to be free market, capitalist, and conservative principles. So that being said, what you see in your chairs is a copy of the publication that goes out quarterly through America's Future Foundation. It's called Doublethink. Gives you an idea. These are publications from 2008 primarily, but it gives you an idea of just some of the issues that America's Future Foundation touches base on. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jason Lima, and we'll start our speaker series panel.
Thank you very much, Heather. My name is Jason Lima again, and also I want to remind everybody before they leave today, if they haven't already done so, to please sign in at the front over here. And if you're interested, you put your name, email address, and we'll keep you in future communications. So I would like to first introduce the panel. First we have Matt Dean, who's a member of the Minnesota State House. He's been the Minnesota State House representative since 2004. He's assigned to the Capital Investment Finance, Healthcare and Human Services Finance, Licensing, and Ways and Means Committees, and he's an entrepreneur and a father of 3. Marianne Stebbins was the state coordinator for Ron Paul's campaign in Minnesota and the Campaign for Liberty. And going down the line, we have Tony Sutton, who has been a Republican Party activist since 1984, has worked on numerous campaigns and in many party leadership positions. He served as executive director and is currently the secretary-treasurer of the Minnesota State Republican Party. Next on the line, we have Sarah Janacek. And Sarah has been involved in Minnesota politics for more than 20 years as a writer and a campaign advisor. She's a Republican activist and a lobbyist, and she publishes now for the bipartisan family of publications called Politics in Minnesota. And for years, she has provided the Republican perspective to local and national media. And finally, last but not least, we have Craig Westover, and he's been a contributing columnist to the Pioneer Press here in Minnesota, the opinion page, and a senior policy fellow at the Minnesota Free Market Institute. And he's been a lifelong Minnesotan, and he has had a varied career that has included 15 years as a freelance writer, and he's also worked in corporate communications and marketing. I'd also like to ask if the panel would like to give further introductions, and what I will do after they give their introductions, it's basically a roundtable discussion. So I'll pose a single question, and they can take it in any order that they would like to. And once they're done, we'll move on to a second question. And depending on time, I definitely want to have some audience participation and get some questions from the audience, as I'm sure you're all very eager to ask a lot of questions. So I'd like to ask if the panel would like to tell them a little bit about themselves, and we'll get on to the next questions.
No, you got in that government database, and you got everything that you need.
All right, we got it all. All right, so the first question, I work for a living, so I have to read off notes, so I apologize for that case. All right, so our first question. People now say that the conservative movement is now in the wilderness. But in many states, the conservative movement has been in the wilderness for quite some time. And we can see that with many of the states in the Union. We recognize these states very well. They have a far left liberal Democratic leadership and at best moderate Republicans in charge. How do we come out of the wilderness in Minnesota? And with that, whoever would like to start with this question.
Well, we come out of the wilderness with a clear, strong message that is different from the Democrats. And we saw this in 1994 when the Republicans took charge of the Republican Revolution of 1994, where we stood up and we were able to list off our principles. And it worked like gangbusters for us. There was a clear difference between the Republicans and Clinton and the Democrats who had held power for 40 years. So we do that by coming back to our principles. I mean, we lost them when Republicans were voting for TARP and were voting for socialism and voting to double the size of the Department of Education and for No Child Left Behind. And we're in a good position now because the economy is going to continue to slide under, in this slide to socialism. We're in an excellent position now to stand up and talk about why the free market works and to actually give the voters an option.
Yeah, let me jump in on that because I think Marianne is right when she talks about coming back to principles, but I think we also have to look at what does that really mean, coming back to principles, because I kind of get a little bit tired sometimes of Republicans who now we suddenly discovered principles as if they, just a brand new concept that are out there. And when we talk about principles, I think that means you have to live up to them. You can't just express them. And let me give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. Is it Paul Ryan or Pat Ryan, the guy from the congressman from Wisconsin? Paul Ryan. I mean, he's supposed to be one of the leaders of the new conservative movement. Yet when we come down to the bailout bill back in October, his comment was, well, this goes against my principles, but I'm voting for it to save my principles. Well, you stop to think, well, what does that mean? I mean, I grab my handy copy of the Constitution, and the first line after the preamble talks about legislation is the sole responsibility of Congress. Yet here's a guy who's standing up for his principles by giving legislative power to some government agency that has no accountability. So living up to your principles means that we have to live up to our principles when they really hurt. And I'm going to pick a little bit on our state Republican Party. We come out and we say, we want to reform the campaign finance reform. We don't want to have the sign off where you get money back from the state when you contribute to political parties. Well, yeah, okay, that's fine, but then I get my letter from the Republican Party asking me to contribute, and not once, but twice they remind me that I can get my $50 back if I contribute to the party. Understand that would really hurt the party not to have that available for them to use, but at the same time we're asking them to vote for us so that we can cut them off welfare, we can cut them off health care, we can freeze public finance. Why should they sacrifice when we're not doing it? So principles is a good point, but you got to live up to them. You can't just talk about them.
Thanks. I would just like to echo that a little bit. Number one, I'd like to thank everybody for being here and for being involved. Really, if we're going to change and we're going to have the majority opinion back, because we've lost that in the country, we need to start by energizing now and by coming together and figuring out what exactly we do believe in. And I think we do believe in the majority opinion. We believe in smaller government. We believe in spending less money. We believe in giving people more power in their families. And that has always resonated, has always worked for us. But we're at a real gut-check time right now, I think, as a party. I think if we look back at the tail end of the Bush administration, where we were spending like crazy, and we were going into debt, and we've set up the economic system that we now have that's giving a family of four $26,000 in deficit debt and $150,000 in just overall debt for every four-person family in the country. We're really at a place where we got a gut check time as a party, where we're going to either differentiate ourselves from the Democrats or move into uncharted territory of becoming an obscure minority if we don't differentiate, I think, rather quickly.
I think that we're entering a new era of the Republican Party and conservative movement. What's happened now is that we've lost the confidence. Conservative Republicans have lost the confidence of a lot of voters. I mean, we were the party of fiscal responsibility, but here we were in Washington spending money like crazy. You know, we were the party, supposed to be party of traditional values, and we had page-chasing congressmen and a wide-stand senator made our airport famous. And so, I mean, a lot of people lost confidence and faith in Republicans. And so we are really at I hate to use these overworn cliches, we are at a crossroads. We've got to decide who we are. And we've got to decide that we're going to be the conservative party. We need to be unabashed, unashamed about it. And it feels like for the last 8 years or so that we've not only gotten away from our principles, but sometimes my perception is that some of our elected officials have been embarrassed to be conservative. And I think that quite frankly there are those in the party who think that, some in the party who think that, well, we've lost the last couple of elections, we need to change our principles, we need to be less conservative. I think it's the wrong conclusion to draw. I think the correct conclusion is that we need to get back to our core principles in order to regain the confidence of those right-of-center voters. I believe this is a right-of-center country, that most people, even in Minnesota, are conservative people. And if we stick to our principles, not just talk the talk, but walk the walk, that we'll be more successful going forward. But we are at this, we're going through a little bit of catharsis. We're going through the beginning of what I think is a new era for this party. But it's going to take, frankly, not just our elected officials, but in the coming election cycle, our candidates too. We're going to have to maintain, message discipline. We can't just all be going off and not being, not talking about what's core principles. Like we have in the past couple of election cycles, not been very disciplined about our message and not really followed through what we said we were going to do.
Sitting on this panel tonight is both thrilling for me and it's also an incredible tragedy. If anyone has noticed, I've been all over the buffalo chicken wings because inevitably they are linked to me in Minnesota politics. Because 20 years ago, I was down at Run-Ins when Run-Ins was hot with another guy reorganizing the Young Republicans, and we built that thing on alcohol and chicken wings. At that time, Republicans were in the wilderness, and we thought there was nothing to do it up, and we were wild-eyed and optimistic, and I went to every BPOU meeting, and I chaired everything, and did blah, 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 blah. And here it is, 20 years later, and here we are. So that's the tragedy. On the other hand, the thrilling part is that you guys are all here because it really does make a difference. That little group of young Republicans we put together includes a lot of people who are holding office today, and not the least of which is our governor. The question was principles. I have a lot to say on this. I'm just going to try to winnow it down and weave in my comments to the question. I agree with everything everybody has said, and I think that we really, as a party, need to affirm, ratify, people who are doing clear examples of what that principle thing is. And the two that come to mind for me are John Klein against pork barrel spending. He ran on that for re-election last time at a time when that wasn't so cool. It was all over his website. He got beat up like hell in his district because he wasn't supporting local projects, but he stuck with it. And I think on our governor on no new taxes. That's a tough one. He's been clear, unequivocal. And so those are principles we can agree on. Finally, I like what I know of this organization so far because I think we've spent way too much time in the social issue wilderness. And so I get really ticked off when people, when I hear moderates, and I know you didn't mean it that way, I get really ticked off about that because I happen to disagree with the party platform on certain particular social issues. I always have, always will. So I'm sitting on a panel and not sitting in Washington someplace. Because we have to agree on the fiscal ones. And we have to be a big tent, lead Atwater on the other ones. And I think if we just focus on the fiscal issues and running our country, we've all talked about it, and it's a tragedy. Here we are living in the decline of America. Don't even get me going. But let's go.
Sarah, I'd like to follow up briefly. Each of you have kind of talked about the party principles and party platform and kind of the base behind the Republican Party. And I have been talking to some people before we started tonight about this, and this is something you've been hearing about a lot lately because, we do feel lost and in the wilderness, not to be cliche about it, but a lot of people talk about getting back to party principles and the original platform. A lot of people who have left the Republican Party that still consider themselves libertarians or conservatives say, well, I agree with the platform, but not what the party's been doing lately, and usually they're talking about social issues. So I'd like to hear everybody talk about what do you consider the party platform? There's a national platform, and states have a platform, but what do you consider the true core Republican principles or platform, Republican or conservative?
Let me jump because I think this is a good starting point for what I want to say. We're talking tonight, and we're going to hear a lot of words thrown around that are almost starting to be used synonymously. Conservative, Republican Party. You can throw the word libertarian in there, to describe some people in the room. And what I'm going to say is that I don't think that those labels are going to mean a whole heck of a lot moving forward for precisely the reasons that you were talking about. That you've got social issues, that you've got fiscal issues. What I'm going to predict is that you're going to start to see those labels mean less and less. And the two labels that are going to start to come out, and I think the Ron Paul campaign had something to do with this focus, and that is you're going to see a collectivist or a statist group, and you're going to see a libertarian or a free market group. And that's going to cross party lines, and people are starting to rearrange themselves. And I think the people who are really going to have an issue here are the ardent social conservatives, because they're going to have to decide, are we going to support the position of what I think is a true Republican position, and that is that in a free society, sometimes you have to support the right of people to do things that you think are stupid, self-destructive, and even morally reprehensible. Or are they going to fall on the side of the collectivist group and simply be another progressive organization that doesn't have a liberal worldview, but that they want to use the power of government to enforce a social position that they think is the right moral position? So I don't like the terms anymore, Republican. What's the Republican Party going to do? I like the idea of, okay, we're either going to be a party that believes in individual liberty, the rule of law, and private property, which are the three classical liberal things that this country was founded on and what the Constitution is all about. Or we're going to be a party that's going to pick and choose and be a menu-driven party. We're going to say we like this on this issue, we like this on this issue, with no underlying principle behind it. And that's my pitch for the evening.
Okay, we all know where I've come from on this moderate thing, but let me tell you this. In some ways, I feel like the covenant has been broken. I think it's perfectly acceptable and fine to get involved in politics because of religious beliefs. I spent more time in my life as a moderate Republican defending evangelical Christian Republicans than I want to know what to do with. And so I guess the question, my point, I guess, is we just focus on the fiscal issues and everything takes care of, the rest takes care of itself.
Yeah, but Sarah, don't you think that the world, that the mom and pop across the kitchen table, and a lot of people, they have positions on these social issues, and can we be viable if we ignore them, or can we be viable if we don't have a position of how we're going to approach them? I don't think we have to take a stand.
Craig, 99% of what government does is economic. It is taxing and it is spending. And what we saw in the Ron Paul movement was that, my gosh, you had pro-choice people, you had pro-life people, you had people all over the place on social issues, but they all came together behind primarily economics. That's the government in our pocketbook. And I think if the Republican Party is going to come back, we have to be extremely cohesive on the economic issues. And, to the moderates, where we get concerned is when the moderates and even John Klein are voting for bankster bailouts, or they're, like Palenti, they're, voting for fees, which are in fact taxes. So that's where I think most people come down when they see Republicans, moderating when it comes to economic issues. That's where we're losing people.
Yeah, and I think that's because if you don't have a core, that's when you start picking your issues, and you say, well, this is the most popular position, or this is the conservative position, so I'm going to grab that on this issue. This is another issue, well, I'm going to be less conservative on this issue. So without the core, I mean, sometimes your principles, if you have a core, sometimes your principles lead you to a conclusion that you may not like. You may not like what is that, but the consequences.
Do you really think it's this or that? I'm frankly, I'm pro-life, and I'm also for individual freedom and personal responsibility, and I don't see a dichotomy in that. So, I don't think it's this or that, Craig. Are you saying it's one or the other?
I think that, for instance, I am very pro-life, I'm more anti-abortion, I guess, and I'll put my credentials for anti-abortion on anybody, but from a political standpoint, when I look at that from a political position, I do not want the government in the fetal protection business. I don't want the government into my daughter's pregnancy telling her that her accidental miscarriage is a homicide until the government says that it's not.
And this is exactly what the conversation the Democrats want us to have, which we shouldn't have. We agreed on core things. We agreed on the free market and that government needs to do things that other people can do individually, but collectively there are things that government has to do. I think what's lost, and I admire Marianne's enthusiasm, but next up is Matt Dean. I think what's lost is there's a disconnect, I think, between the ideologues, good, bad, otherwise, and our activists, and the tough job of actually governing. I'm quite sure there are votes that Matt Dean has taken that he would have, in a perfect world, not have taken in the art of compromise, but he's one of our guys and we support him. I don't know if that's a good handout to you or not, that way.
Well,
Where did they compromise?
There you go. Well, obviously, you want to do it over. You do the best job that you can, and I'm really proud of my record, and I stand by it. But I don't take an oath to a party for my job. I take an oath to the Constitution. That's what I do. That's my job. And it's not to the Republican Party, it's not to a caucus, it's not to the people even that I represent or a group, it's to the Constitution. And that for me, has a lot to do with civil liberties issues, which for me is which I can defend from a pro-life basis. Other people might approach it from a different basis, but that's really our job. And when we hold our elected officials' feet to the fire, it shouldn't be as Republicans or as Democrats, it's as people who represent us and the Constitution.
The Constitution makes it a lot easier because, the Constitution says, look, criminal matters are left to the states, and, so Roe v. Wade has been, we had pro-choice people who agree with that, on the Ron Paul campaign. Look, the Constitution doesn't give the federal government the right to be in there, so it goes back to the states. And at the state level, you can say, look, I don't agree with funding it. And so we can agree that we don't fund these activities at the very least. So we can find a lot of common ground.
Yeah, I think the Constitution is the key element here, because right now, for instance, we're trying to get a budget, put together, and Matt, you have to decide in the budget, well, are we going to not fund, women and children, or are we not going to fund old people in nursing homes? And that you can't, that's a lose-lose situation. But if you go to the Constitution and you look at the Constitution, and say, either one of those are really functions of government. And suddenly things are clear. We've got all these issues around school. To Sarah's point, we've got all these issues around schools. Where do you say under God at the end of the Pledge of Allegiance? Do you even say the Pledge of Allegiance? What do you teach? What do you do? What kind of prayer rooms do you have for whom? All these issues. But the only reason we have those issues is that we broke the fundamental threshold principle, which is people don't have a choice of what kind of schools they go to. So if you go back to the fundamental principle, let people have a choice in what schools they go to, then you get rid of all these problems. Because you don't like it, you go down the street. You don't like the Jerry Falwell School for the morally upright, you can go down to the Timothy Leary School for the chemically enhanced, and that's your choice. So
I agree.
I knew you would.
Okay, we'll shift gears a little bit here. Considering America's Future Foundation is focused specifically on developing the youth of this country, I think the segue from the schools into this question is actually a little bit appropriate. Now, how do we present this message of conservatism or even libertarianism, which you can really sometimes have youth identify with, to the younger generations when the liberal influence of mass media, of the mainstream media, college universities, etc.
I'll go first.
Get Sarah on pitchfork.
Because I've been running this great social experiment in my operation. There's lots of bios of me that are old, so no big deal. I got out of the business of lobbying a while ago. And I think some of you know Politics Minnesota, the directory, okay? And then I turned Politics Minnesota to an online thing. I built that. My sweat, blood, and tears is in that book, and I sold it to a publicly held company, Dolan Media Company. Now, in the course of the last few years of doing my stuff, I, on purpose, hired every smart-ass, lefty liberal from McAllister. And I paid my boys by the hour. And when I sold my company, and it cost me part of the purchase price, is everybody who worked for me came to the dance and was employed by Dolan Media Company. And these guys are screaming lefties, and they all of a sudden it's a whole different picture of, well, gee, we're working weekends. Can't you pay us more? Under the old thing, you used to give us bonuses and stuff. I said that's when I ran things. You have a job with guaranteed health insurance and all of that, so they're seeing that firsthand. But I have instant message with conversations with these guys all the time, and it's been fascinating for these lefty liberal guys now in their mid-20s to watch me as a solo entrepreneur go from paying them for the amount of work to having the stability of a job when many of their friends are unemployed with health benefits they have now, but also to watch them watch Barack Obama. Yes, we can, Barack Obama, and they feel like they have been handed and are being sold down the river. So the answer to the question is, doing what I do. These guys are witnessing different environments of working freelance for me, which was great because when there's a lot of work, you get a lot of money and big checks, and I like that. I like that accountability. When I've got a problem at 2 o'clock in the morning on my website, I want to call somebody, get it out of bed, and get it fixed. But also the trade-off here of being owned by corporate America is that stability of a paycheck and benefits that when I was had those guys working for the freelancers, I couldn't offer. So I guess the short answer to my question, and it was a long explanation, is you get people engaged in the system and watch them go through the process of the business decisions you have to make when you're a small person, like I was, instantly.
Well, I like where Craig was going in the answer to the last question. The long-term solution is to start to break this monopoly on public education, because we know what they're teaching them in schools, and it's not much about real civics, and it's not much about the free market. So the long-term answer, and we actually have a good opportunity for this with our budget crisis, the long-term answer is to start to give parents tax credit for sending their children to private education. And if we give them, my kid was in a private school last year, it cost $4,000 for the whole year's worth of tuition. If we gave every parent $4,000 back, and what does it cost these days to educate a kid in the public school system? Is it $12,000 or? It's a lot of money. We're saving money. I mean, we can make this in a budgetary argument that this is necessary to do to save money, but long term, we got to get people out of this, the kids out of the school system that's teaching them all the wrong things. They're growing up as little socialists. That's how they are. Short-term solution is something we're doing with Campaign for Liberty, something you guys are doing right here, and that's talking about it, and talking about economics, and talking about the free market. And that's something we're going to continue with Campaign for Liberty, and there are a number of groups working on this. And we all need to be missionaries on the free market and be talking about it with our neighbors and friends and family to get them to understand. And it's going to be a lot easier with Obama's economy for them to open their ears.
I have a very simple answer. Ask them a question. I think that if we stop with the demonizing, which I mean, we've all done it, and stop demonizing people on left, but ask them a question. Agree to agree, I guess, rather than agree to disagree, and say, okay, this is what you're saying. Now explain to me how this works. And be able to ask that next question. So when somebody, and I'll plug my column here today in the St. Paul paper, when somebody says, hey, if you lay off a government worker, that's good for the that's not good for the economy because it takes a consumer out of the economy. Well, can you ask him a question and say, really? Paying somebody for doing something that doesn't produce value is a plus for the economy? And take them, walk them through the economics. I think it starts as a one-to-one thing, and you have to be able to counter those kind of basic economic questions. And I'll take Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. Everybody who wants to be involved in this movement should read that book and understand that book and understand that principle, and you can argue any little economic policy from the bailout, from the TARP run down, and you can win.
Well, I think the youth of today, people in college are coming right into the workforce right now, are getting sort of on a macro scale, getting a big lesson in economics right now, practical economics. And I think they're seeing, quite frankly, and we'll see as the Obama socialistic agenda continues to bring the economy down, and they're going to get a real practical lesson, which will drive people, frankly, from an ideological perspective and a practical political perspective, drive people our way. I mean, I'm in business. I own a restaurant company, and I can see that the practical effects. I mean, the restaurant industry, one of the few industries not getting any bailout money from anybody. We have to make it the old-fashioned way, one burrito at a time. But young people today get the practical lesson. My little brother was a flaming liberal, and got his first paycheck and became Republican when he figured out he wasn't making what he was told he was making because so much of it was coming out of the check, and suddenly became conservative. I mean, I think a lot of people are getting some practical lessons. Yeah, they voted for Obama, and now when they're going out looking for jobs that don't exist, suddenly that real practical lesson, that wealth isn't being generated, wealth isn't being created. You can't love employment and hate employers. And I think that young people are figuring this out and will next, unfortunately, because of the economic situation over the next couple of years, we figure it out in a really hard way.
I think unless you voted for Barack Obama, you're unlike most 18 to 25-year-olds by about 44%. 18 to 25, 18 to 36 went for Barack Obama in very large numbers, young females especially. By unprecedented numbers. But I think when I talk to young people, particularly in college campuses, the things that they are very, very ideologically driven today, probably more so than when I was in college 20 years ago. And when you express what Obama and particularly the current budget and the current proposals on the table, if you propose that as a moral document between the government and the people, and that moral document is selling them down the river, that will eradicate the American dream for the entire generation of young people, which it will, economically. They start to get that. And I call it hope. Hope, remember that? And change. I said hope for looters, moochers, and geezers. And they kind of understand it. Then you kind of get them listening to it. And you say, this is really good for looters, it's really good for moochers, and it's really good for geezers, but it's really not all that good for you because it's selling your future down the river because you'll never be able to afford the lifestyle that your parents had unless we make a change right now. That kind of gets with it.
What's wrong with geezers?
I love geezers.
I'm old enough. I remember when the Democrats said that there was a right to fire.
Chronologically challenged.
Well, Craig, you're going to get Social Security. These kids aren't, and that's another area where we can tackle them. They're not going to see Social Security.
I do not think young people are a lost cause, or I actually think there's going to be some low-hanging fruit that we can get a lot of these younger people back. I mean, I think part of the reason we lost so many was a failure over the last 8 years. The reason that Obama was able to win wasn't that suddenly the country became liberal. It was our failure to frankly live up to what we talked about. And so that the hope and the change and all that rhetoric appealed to a lot of young people, a lot of people in general, because of the failure of Republicans, conservatives, whatever label you want to put on them, to follow through on what we talked about doing. And I think that if we start following through, we're going to recapture a lot of those young people and get them back in the future elections.
One fun aside, I don't know how many saw, and I wake up at 5 every morning and I consume so much news, I have now lost the ability to attribute where I got it from. But do you realize that Barack Obama can't even speak to 40 people without the glass panels?
Yes.
And of course, I made sure everybody on my TFL leading team and another 45 other people saw that article. That was shocking to them that somebody couldn't go into a room with 40 people and talk without glass panels. And so I think in terms of the Obama administration and Democrats, I think besides all this loftiness and ideals we're talking about, little things like that are really important. The fact that this guy who seems so real and personable can't talk without a teleprompter, it speaks volumes to a lot of people.
I think Tony hit on a good point there in the sense that one of the things that made Reagan such an effective communicator was that he was optimistic. And I think that's something that we sometimes fall into a trap when we talk about the free market, is we talk about it, and we do kind of talk about it from the sense that everybody has to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, and we talk about responsibilities, and we talk about the scary parts of the free market instead of talking about the optimistic parts, the parts that create opportunity, the parts that create opportunity, the parts that, really, that when you have a free market, that it helps the poor, it elevates people, and we don't really talk about it always in that optimistic tone. And I think that's another area that we can all improve on.
I should say that I'm sure that you have quite a few questions, and we're just going to run through a few more questions now and then open it up to the audience. So keep your questions in mind for any of the topics. When President Obama took the White House with expanded Democrat majorities in Congress, it seemed public sentiment was moving against free markets in the midst of the economic crisis. So as the bailout was released to the public, the Republicans stood firm and public outcry strengthened. So it essentially unified the party a little bit. And sort of some of the things that we were talking about, unifying libertarians, conservatives, Republicans, quite a few different groups of people with similar but different ideological beliefs. So, as it is Bernie Madoff goes to jail day, and we, bailout is all over the news all day, every day. That's all we talk about. Let's talk about bailout.
I don't buy the premise. I don't think the country voted for Obama because they wanted they wanted to move to the left, or they wanted socialized bailouts, or those sorts of things. I think that again, they voted for Obama because of the contrast with what we had been offered, which wasn't a lot. We had been, again, party fiscal responsibility, not being responsible. And so Obama is frankly, overreaching. You can already see the snapback, in the general public, where people are like, we didn't, billion at $1.5 trillion deficit. I'm not that old, but I remember when the debt was hit $1 trillion, much less the debt. That was a while ago, but still, for the deficit hit $1.5 trillion. People that this isn't the change people voted for. I think it frankly is you're already starting to see that we're regaining some of that lost credibility on fiscal issues because of that. The Republicans are holding except for a couple senators from out east, holding firm, against these sorts of things. And so I think that I don't buy the premise that that's what people voted for. But they voted against what we had to offer. They voted for some rhetoric, and frankly, this isn't the change that people want. And this is where the opportunity will present itself for Republicans and conservatives if we're in a position to take advantage of it. To take advantage of the dissatisfaction, to take advantage of the fact that these things aren't going to fix the economy. These things aren't going to make things better. And we've got to be in a position to take advantage of that. And that's going to be our challenge, quite frankly.
If there's one thing fiscal conservatives have done wrong in this country, and this is a provocative thing to throw on the table when we've been talking about free markets, but we have misrepresented what a free market is. There is no free market. We've been government regulated for a long time. And I think if there's one tragedy in where we are right now at this moment in time, it's that we bailed out the banks. We're in the mortgage foreclosure crisis we are in because of the liberal idea that we need to lend more money to more people to buy houses. Screw your credit ratings. We really don't care. That's the core of where we are today. And I think that was really hammered home to me last week. Another $500 billion frickin' dollars to bail out people on mortgages who can't pay them, and we're not going to look at what they spent the mortgages on or the second lines of credit. And so we are in a system where a liberal intention of more people home ownership, who can argue with that? But we didn't look at basic factors like who can afford to borrow the money. And now, Joe Blow is going to pay for Jane Smith down, who bought the mansion down the block, had the swank vacations. Government's not going to look at that. They're going to bail her out too. And I think for working people, for all of us, we're all working people, that is an injustice that we need to capitalize on. That we are not rewarding personal responsibility.
Well, meanwhile, we've got interest rates back down at 0%. I mean, people understand that, you know, an economy can't be run on debt, but that's what we've been doing. And, you know, the Federal Reserve obviously has to blame the Federal Reserve and a lot of government programs, as Sarah's saying, you know, we were encouraging home ownership and people really couldn't handle it. But we're trying it all over again now. We're not trying to correct our problems, and you know, Republicans take a lot of the blame for this too. We've got to be standing up. I mean, there are some people who are criticizing the Federal Reserve finally, and we've got to be willing to stand up and say, you know, look, the Federal Reserve caused a lot of these problems as well.
I think what Barney Frank and the Democrats will say is that this problem was caused by George Bush and deregulation, and that if it wasn't for this deregulation, we'd run in the banks. You hear him every night, and that's what he's saying, is the government's fault because we weren't regulating them enough, when in fact it was our own really poor fiscal policies that forced these mortgages on folks who couldn't afford them, and then changed the way that we regulate the markets with things like mark-to-market, which is ruining our banks right now, with things like short selling. We can allow short selling in the commodities market without what they used to call an uptick rule, which is draining those markets. And we're allowing naked short selling. So we're draining the markets through these really poor fiscal policies. And some of that message is getting down to our level. But when we're looking at the state, as Minnesota is saying, should we take the bailout of the stimulus money? You're saying, well, what if that means that it's going to make us go even more broke in 2 years? They also will say, you can take the money, but you have to spend it as long as you don't spend it any differently than you were before. So does that change? If it says that you have to spend it the Washington way, if you take Medicaid money, you can't spend it smartly, you got to spend it our way. It's only going to dig ourselves deeper into a hole in 2 years. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to dig yourself deeper in a hole. You know, if you need to lose 100 pounds, your doctor doesn't tell you, well, you can have another 25 Snicker bars a day as long as you continue to eat 4,000 calories a day. That's really what the stimulus bill is doing, particularly with the Medicaid dollars. So I think there's people like Governor Sanford in South Carolina who's really taking a lot of hits. He's saying, no, don't give us the money because our state will just be driven into a deeper hole. I think folks like that should be applauded for having a little bit of courage to say no to some of these federal stimulus.
Do you think Plenty will say no? He already said he would, right?
He said if they're dumb enough to give it to us, we should be smart enough to spend it.
And I agree with that.
I don't.
And that's part of the problem. But again, I think that my earlier point, I think part of our problem here is we wander in the wilderness. There's a serious disconnect between having a panel like this and talking about among ourselves and actually having the governor. And for the governor to have turned down that stimulus money would have hurt us much harder long term.
Well, Sanford's looking awfully good for president, though. He's becoming very popular.
And I don't disagree with that, but on the other hand, it's a different thing to be an activist. It's a much different thing to actually be elected and to have to govern.
Well, I tend to agree with Sarah that it is different. That, you know, we up here, a lot of us have the luxury of not having to actually govern. But if that's the problem with, and this is, you know, why I am not a conservative and I fashion myself as a libertarian, because if you're going to make those kind of compromises, every compromise always goes to the left. And the starting point for the next compromise is to the left. And it's somewhere along the line you have to draw a point in the sand and say, yeah, I want a huge tax cut, but I'll compromise with you and have a little tax cut, rather than going in the other direction and saying that we're going to have a little tax increase and call that a victory. somewhere along the line, you have to stand on principle and you have to say that we're not going to compromise to the left. And that to me is the fundamental problem. All our compromises are to the left, and we declare victory because we didn't go quite as far as they wanted. Eventually, you lose.
Well, let's be clear here. Ripping on Palenti is not going to get us into majority status. And as I started out, there are core things, there are core fights you pick when you're in leadership, and there are core fights you don't.
Well,
Just a minute. Not accepting stimulus money when the rest of the country is damn stupid. But as I said earlier, opening remarks, standing firm on no new taxes is a much bigger issue, I think, to us here than turning down stimulus taxes.
Well, yeah, but let me jump in on that one too, because Palenti formed this 21st century tax reform committee. They came up with it, and one of the criteria was it has to be revenue neutral. Okay, they came up with a solid, sound economic plan that they're going to, basically the fundamental part of it is they're going to eliminate the corporate income tax and replace it with a broader-based sales tax. Okay, now if your argument is that we don't need that extra revenue, then you don't have to increase the broader base of the sales tax. But if you're dealing with economics and you have to be revenue neutral, the broader base sales tax is a solid economic concept for delivering stable revenue to the state over the corporate income tax. Palenti's knee-jerk no new taxes, and I'm a no new taxes guy, reaction was no, we're not going to increase the sales tax. When it was his idea to make it revenue neutral, they came up with the sound economic policy for making it revenue neutral. Now, if he wants to argue we don't need the revenue, and let's not broaden the sales tax, I'm going to be the first person to line up behind him. But you can't knock a solid economic principle and say, well, I don't like the results. The principle is there, but I don't like the results, so we're not going to do it. That's not core. That doesn't work. And that's why I don't feel like I'm knocking Palenti. I really want, the guy's a great politician. I'd really like to see him have a core and operate from it. But you can't, I guess my point is, that's a perfect example where principle leads you to a conclusion. And you say, well, the principle led me where I didn't want to go, so we're not going to do it.
And I'm going to argue with the notion that you can't criticize a Republican when they're going astray. You know, if Palenti's accepting the bailout money, I think you can criticize them. And you know, one reason we lost is because we were putting up Republicans who had abandoned all our principles. And I know a lot of people were criticizing McCain, and you know, they were criticized for criticizing McCain. But why did we lose? We weren't putting up an alternative, and Republicans weren't willing to stand up and say, you know, the bankster bailout is wrong. We weren't allowed to say that because our candidate was for it. And so I think we do have to, when our candidates go astray, we have to stand up and hold their feet to the fire. They're never going to come back to the principles if we're going along with them.
And I think that's really the job of activists to do, is to hold our feet to the fire, because we are always going to get caught in the bubble and go astray. But particularly with the stimulus and some of the other things, that it's our job also to to help the governor succeed, and sometimes that means being in a different spot than he is, and pulling things a little differently. We passed in the House last week something that didn't get a lot of press, but it says that we have to balance our budget for 4 years. That means if we do accept stimulus dollars, that we can't just do it to patch a hole. We need to do it to fix ongoing problems. And it was a very, very important thing that was passed. The Democrats passed it just to jab Palenti a little bit, but it was something that, we got in a little trouble with the governor's office because it does put them in a more difficult spot. But we should do that. We should balance our books long term, and we shouldn't use this to just patch a hole and be in a bigger mess in 2 years. So we got to start thinking.
I think we can hold people accountable, hold our elected officials accountable, Republican elected officials, but that's, part of the problem is until we get a benevolent Republican dictatorship, we need to hang tough on these things. But we also need to look at the fact that we can hold the line on taxes, so close the gap without raising taxes against strong DFL majorities in the House and Senate. That would be a heck of an accomplishment. And I think if we put the Democrats in a position now, they are going to have to vote against their constituencies. They're going to have to cut, HHS. They're going to have to cut things that go against their constituencies. And that's putting them in a very difficult position. Now, I'm hopeful, and I would like to see, like all of us, that this opportunity with the budget deficit here in Minnesota and the economic crisis, that we can actually get some real structural reform in spending. Not just put a Band-Aid on it for the next couple of years and hope for the best, but actually get some real structural reform so that we can kind of ratchet back government now. We've talked about it, and even my hero Ronald Reagan talked about it, wasn't able to do it. We've got to start, this is why I think we're entering a new era where we can actually ratchet back government for real. We just don't have the money anymore, except for the money Obama's printing in the basement of the White House. We just don't have the bucks. We don't have the dough. We can't do it. And the Chinese aren't going to buy our bonds anymore, so we got to figure out a different way.
Even when Hillary begs, they're not buying.
This is why there's a new era, not just in our conservative movement or this party, but in this country, because we are all starting to come to the conclusion, of course us here in this room first, but the American people will come to this conclusion as well. We just don't have the money. And it's not that we have to, it's not that we are having to be parsimonious. We actually spend a lot of money. I actually think that there's a lot of things in government that are somewhat extravagant. I actually had the honor of being deputy state auditor, Pat Anderson, the state auditor. We looked at local governments, and gosh, just in little Minnesota local governments, you can see how you can make some savings there. And things weren't always, believe it or not, run as efficiently as they could be. People are figuring out that we've got to do it a different way, and that's where Obama has got so far this way that the positive will be it'll snap. I'm optimistic that it'll snap back, and the result will be real reform, economic and fiscal reform at the federal and state level.
Let me just quickly throw one comment out there. Structural reform is a nice catchphrase, but freezing government employee salaries is not structural reform. Structural reform is saying, here's some programs that don't work, we get rid of them, and we fully fund the programs that are legitimate functions of government. That's structural reform. Cutting 10% across the board, that's not structural reform. Structural reform is saying, this department is something that's outside the purview of government and shouldn't be done. This is a program that's within the purview of government, but it's not working, and you cut it, and you get rid of the people who are doing it, and you get government back within its limited constitutional obligations. I go back to the example I used earlier. It's ethically impossible to make a decision, do we cut welfare mothers, or do we cut ethanol subsidies? I mean, you can't make that decision. You have to go back to some principle and say, this is a proper function of government, this is not, this one gets funded, this one gets cut. I sympathize a great deal with Eric Magnuson in the Supreme Court, that sure there might be some fat in the budget that he's proposing, but providing public defenders and fully funding our judicial system. If there's one thing government is supposed to do, it's supposed to provide a judicial system that protects all of us, so that all of our rights are protected. And we're treating it like it was an ethanol subsidy, that it's got to take its 10% cut, and it's got to take its fair share. That is war. That's an important part of the government, and that should be fully funded. And that includes adding employees, adding public defenders, because right now our public defenders are, they've got twice the caseload that people have in the state, across the nation. That's how you do real reform. You look and say, this is a proper function of government, and within that proper function of government, these are the programs that are working, and everything else goes. And that's your starting point.
And where are these politicians with guts to say that? Matt, when you say that, we've got to cut a program or programs.
Stay tuned on Monday. Different people out there.
All right, we're going to go ahead with some audience questions. I can see some fidgeting, so we'll start with one, and then we'll break it open to anybody else. They can either raise their hand, we'll get you the microphone, or they can come up here. But first, we'll start off with Brandon.
Thank you. Hey, panelists, as we know, logic doesn't win elections. This last election, vague promises, vague theories, no plans, no ideas, didn't matter. How do we sell our plans? How do we sell free markets? How do we get that realm? Why can't we promise the same thing? Why can't we promise hope, change, opportunity, and then get the details, we'll leave that until later? I mean, that's what the current administration is doing. They won the election. Why can't we go and promise everyone the world? Promise them hope, opportunity, and change.
Well, somebody started with this, and I got the working Janacek theory of elections, finely tuned in 1984, stumbling around the state of Rudy Boschwitz. And that is this, the people who win elections are the most optimistic people in the race. And I think that Republicans for some time now, we try to be too responsible and preaching gloom and doom, and we haven't preached optimism. I mean, watching Barack Obama was something else, man. Optimism and all of that. So I think that we have to turn what we're saying into being the most optimistic men and women in America. And since I'm so discouraged right now, I don't know how to do that. I'll work on it.
I think that, people like Sarah and Tony who really understand elections and how to win elections in the technical sense, those are the people that we can turn to. But what we have to supply them with is the enthusiasm of the grassroots, the people who are going to get out there and do the work. Obama, yeah, he's charismatic and does all that, but take away the grassroots, the people who was inspiring, the people who would grab people at coffee shops, and the people who would do the door-to-door stuff, and the stuff that these guys know how to coordinate and without them, he's got nothing. He's got a teleprompter. So it goes back to what we talked about earlier about the education, about the one-to-one being able to describe why you're excited about the free market, why you're excited about individual liberty, why individual sovereignty, personal property, and the rule of law means something to you and what it means. Why the big difference between what we're offering and what the Democrats are offering is we're offering, making decisions about your life, you're going to choose them. The Democrats are saying we're going to choose them. The only common ground I see between what I talked about earlier is between the statist view and the libertarian type view is the libertarian view, I want the right to control my own life, and the common ground is the collectivists want to control my own life. And that's the only common ground we got.
We've got to sell the sizzle, and there was a paper that just came out a couple months ago, The Sizzle of Economic Freedom by Lawrence McClellan and Bob Murphy, the both economists with Pacific Research Institute, and they based their study on the Heritage Foundation Freedom Index that I believe has been put out for several years now. But they basically take a look at the countries that are free, and the Heritage Foundation, first of all, rates those countries. We've got Hong Kong is up near the top. We're actually just one step above Canada right now, the United States. But you look at those countries that have a free market, more free than the United States even, those are the most prosperous countries. So we sell prosperity, and we do need to be optimistic. We can't be selling the pessimism, as you say, and I'm guilty of getting a little gloom and doomy myself, but I would recommend to all of you to go Google Sizzle of Economic Freedom, and it's a PDF, it's a great document, read about that, because that is going to help us all to go out there and sell the free market in a positive light. Who doesn't want prosperity? Who doesn't want freedom? But people don't understand that, government, regulations, and taxes, those are the things that take away our freedom, they take away our prosperity. So that's something I would encourage you all to read.
And I got to put in my plug here because we're not getting paid, so I get to do a free commercial, right? The Minnesota Free Market Institute is bringing Larry McClellan in to talk about that report, and he also has one where he ranks the states by economic freedom and what that means. And he'll be here for a luncheon meeting on April 14th. That's a Tuesday right before tax day. And do we have a spot yet, Pat?
Can't remember, it's a downtown Minneapolis hotel.
Downtown Minneapolis hotel, but it'll be April 14th, a luncheon meeting, so I would...
Invitations will go out next week. So.
If I could just maybe just jump in on one thing, I recruit candidates for the Minnesota House. So when you talk about winning, first you win the argument and then you win the vote, and that's up to all of us to do. And whether you are a person who's is an activist, that's great, that's your involvement. if you know somebody else who you think would be a good candidate, we need the right message with the right messengers. And that's what it's gonna take to get it back. It's gonna take a lot of people at the grassroots level. So we can't just switch the channel changer from one channel to the next looking for our Barack Obama, because I don't think he's out there right now. I don't think we've got a brobot, as they're calling him now, who with the teleprompters ready to go with the flags behind. We need to go from the grassroots up, and I think we've got the right message. We need the right messengers. So most people run for office because somebody else asked them to, or they said that they thought that they were a good person. So I can't let the opportunity go by without doing a little recruiting. So think about it, and also particularly for folks that you know at every level, we really do need voices.
Well, while we need the candidates, we can't forget that we need to be prepping the voting field. Sometimes, political activists, we kind of sit on the couch for a year, and then we gear up in, June, getting ready for the election. But right now, we need to be out there talking to our neighbors and friends. This is something Campaign for Liberty is working on, encouraging people to be out there prepping the voter field right now.
Elections are about contrast, quite frankly. And one of our failures, frankly, is we have not cut enough of a contrast in the past couple of election cycles between us and the Democrats, at least in the public's perception. And I think we have to be optimistic. We have to present that, as Craig mentioned earlier, not just the scary side of free markets, but the positive side. I mean, we have to talk about America's best days really are ahead of us. And we have to be confident enough in our philosophy and ideology that we need to espouse it and be confident enough that, frankly, if it's adopted and the country moves in that direction, the country can be more successful, that our best days are ahead of us. But elections are about contrast. We need to strike a brighter line between us and the liberals on the left. And I think we haven't always done that the last couple election cycles. But if we do that, I think we'll be a lot more, and I think we will, and we'll be a lot more successful in the next couple election cycles.
Oh, and I should say, as a side note, our speakers did request teleprompters tonight, but the board took a vote. We didn't want to be very fiscally responsible to make that purchase.
They're also bulletproof.
Chris has a question.
Hi, I guess basically my question is just, I'm sitting here listening to this and I get frustrated and I'm thinking, has the concept of the United States of America and the Constitution failed? Because I sit here and I think my whole life I've seen Democrats, Republicans, I listen to all this talk about how to get Republicans elected, and I feel a little heartbroken, like, would it even matter? Because government's just increased in size constantly, and even under Ronald Reagan it increased in size, who I really have respect for what he did. And given what Bush has done with TARP 1, and kind of pseudo-nationalizing banks, and what Obama's doing with the spending and TARP 2 and all of this, is it time as conservatives and libertarians that we start at least prepping people for the concept of secession from this union? And we need to, and I know it's radical, I say it's radical, and that's why we need to start prepping and talking about this. What is each of your opinions on something like that?
I got to speak up, because I am very optimistic about the future of this country. I believe, look, we've got some challenges, we've got some really big challenges, but I believe in this, very at my core of who I am, in this Constitution, in this country. I believe that at the end of the day, that the American people, and our way of life, and our Constitution will prevail. And we've got these challenges, and this is, I'm sure it seems like, 5 years, 10 years seems like a long time, but over the course of the history of a nation, of a people, the course we've been on, it's not irreparable, it's not impossible, and I really believe, frankly, that the opportunity, since the left is so far overreaching, that's going to be their Waterloo. And that's where we're going to be able to snap back and get this country back to being a constitutional nation. A nation that follows the American values, the hard work, personal responsibility, all those things that made America, and has made America great. I mean, that's why, I'm optimistic. Things are going to change, but it's going to take some work. It's not going to just happen, overnight, or happen if we sit around and talk to each other, complaining about it. We got to go out there and fight. And that's why I think if we go out there and fight, we'll be able to change this.
Chris, I think a lot of this can start at the state level. We have, there is a bill to reclaim, the 10th Amendment that's through the State House, and I don't know what the odds are there. It's a resolution. It'd be nice if we had a governor who rejected, the bailout stimulus, porculus funds, so that we could, again, reclaim our state's rights, and I think that's probably the best tack we can take.
Yeah, I think I was going to say that. I agree with Marianne on that. That to throw out a term like secession, that's pretty hot. It's pretty radical. But I do think that there are places where we should just say no, and that's not just at the state level, but that's at our individual level too. And we each have to come to that conclusion. What government programs are we eligible for that we're not going to take, or what government benefits that we're not going to take? And as a state, what things do we really want to be in No Child Left Behind? Do we really want to take the stimulus dollars? Those, I think, are valid issues that get to your point. The other thing I'd be careful of is when we talk about government, to use an old cliche, size doesn't really matter, it's how you use it. And government, when we talk about government, we should not be talking about smaller government, we should be talking about limited government. We should begin getting back to the Constitution is not about big government or small government. It's about limited government. It's about limiting the functions that government has. Government should be very strong in performing those functions. We don't want a weak government that doesn't do anything. We do want a strong government, but we want that government to be strong where the Constitution says it should be strong, and not, broad-based that does a lot of things poorly. So I'd be careful about using the term big government, small government. I like the term limited government better than
Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. If I had to distill down the message that I think resonates the most with the left, and I tell you something, I think of anybody out here, maybe exception of Matt, I got to deal with more Democrats on a daily basis. The one that really gets it is this idea, pursuit of happiness. Equality of opportunity does not mean equality of result. And if there is, I'm not quite sure how we frame that, but everybody, including my lefty liberal guys who work for me, who got 26 grand in student loans, are going, gosh darn it, why didn't I have the luxury of taking out a line of credit on my house that the government would now forgive me for? I'm personally on the hook for my student loans. And so I think if there's anything concrete we can do is basic. I mean, that's the beauty of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. They're based on basic human instinct. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness does not mean equality of opportunity. It does not mean equality. It means equality of opportunity, but not equality of result. And so I think if we can think about a cosmic message of optimism, I think it's that. I think that the conversation we've had, Democrats have all reached, and that's where it's going to come back and bite, is that people who had equality of opportunity have not achieved equality of result through no fault of their own. Life happens, SHIT happens, and that's where we need to go.
I'll just get back to this sizzled economic freedom again, and just looking at the highlights here. I mean, most of what Democrats want to accomplish, whether it's getting rid of disparity of income, these things, freedom accomplishes this. They accomplishes everything they want to accomplish. U.S. states with greater economic freedom have less income equality, and you can go right down the list. Everything Democrats want to accomplish, the free market does it better. Not that was the question.
All right, I'm going to go into the audience here. I know that we started getting a little bit of base, so we're competing, but we'll continue. I know we have a few more
Sounds
questions.
like a washing machine, but like a thin pool.
Hi there, I'm Gilbert Higuera. I ran for House in 66A. I want to direct this question to the conservatives versus the libertarians. This last year, I think, has been proof positive that the libertarians are coming into the Republican Party and are being very, very active, are energizing the party, re-energizing the party. And I have the question to the conservatives, because you guys had your chance with the Contract for America. You had your chance with the Bush years. Now is the chance for you to open up, and welcome into the Republican Party those of us who really believe in aren't just figuratively speaking conservative values economically, but are sincerely speaking conservative values economically, and in some cases socially. Are you willing to let us into the party? Are you willing to welcome us in? Are you willing to work with us? Are you willing to move in that direction that the young people have demonstrated with the Ron Paul movement, that we want more freedom across the board, not just certain areas, not just pick and choose? Are you willing to open up to us? And are you willing to demonstrate that the future of the party is a small L libertarian conservative direction, and not just, you know, the 96, 94 version of conservatism that didn't do anything, and we're here where we are in 2009.
Gilbert, can I just, well, first of all, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to answer the question because I'm conservative and I'm libertarian. I don't see them necessarily as being separate. I see where you see that because, right, the conservatives came in 1994, and for 2 years, I believe it was literally 2 years, they did reduce the budget. But then it was, I think, 4 years out where it started to dip up again. So, would you, I don't know if you would consider me a libertarian or a conservative. I'm a liberty Republican. And I think that, as Reagan said, the heart of conservatism is libertarianism.
I don't see the terms as being mutually exclusive. Quite frankly, I think we should welcome in anybody, and all people, who bring energy and vibrancy into the party. I think a lot of new folks got involved in the last election cycle have brought a lot of new energy into the party. And I've been active for a long time, so I've seen the different waves of people have come into the party who bring that vibrancy and that activism that's needed right now, quite honestly. And we need to re-energize, and that's why I've mentioned to people, and mentioned it here tonight a couple times, about how we're in a new era. We have new people coming into the party that's actually energizing a lot of the people that are the old timers. You know, seeing that there's some bold activism coming into the party has reinvigorated some people who were kind of losing hope, and I think that's good for the movement. And it's good for our cause. And so I absolutely think that we should welcome in everybody who wants to get this party and this movement, you know, back on track.
Nobody was more excited about Ron Paul than me. I'm the ultimate libertarian Republican. The more the merrier. The two are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I don't know if the two are mutually exclusive. I think conservatives are redeemable. I think that if people, to make the Republican Party a big tent, you don't do what the Democrats do about constituent politics. To make the Republican Party a big tent, you say, these are the principles we believe in, and anybody who follows these principles is welcome to come in. And if we understand that principles, and you can call them conservative principles, you can call them American principles, you can call them libertarian principles, I don't care what you call them, but Sarah, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I like the ideas of individual sovereignty, private property, and the rule of law, which are kind of, they're flip sides of the same coin. If you believe in those principles and understand that sometimes sticking with those principles are going to lead to consequences that you might personally not like, you're welcome in the Republican Party. We're not interested in menu conservatives, or even menu libertarians that say, I have to be on this position on this issue. We can disagree on end issues as long as we start from the same principle. Because if you start from the same principle, you can always have a conversation. If you're not on the same principle, it's like talking to the dolphins. You can't relate to creatures that swim around in the ocean when you're walking around on land. You can't have a conversation if your basic principles aren't there. So if we all start from the same principles, we may disagree, but we can talk to each other, we can reason it out, we can argue, because we're starting from the same principles. So that's my concept of a big tent. We all accept the same principles, and we all realize sometimes those principles are going to lead where we don't want to go, but we accept that and try to change people's minds.
Just Gilbert, I just want to thank you for running, and I know that it was worth it for you, as it is for almost every candidate I've ever talked to. So thank you for doing it.
66A is Houseman? No.
I ran for 66A.
Is who?
I was
ran against John Lesh. Against John Lesh. I salute you, sir. Okay.
Thank you for doing that. I would just say that I'm glad we're not so big of a majority that we don't need every set of hands that we can to help. We are not large enough to reject anybody who wants to help.
Exactly.
I know that in my campaign, that some of the folks who had fallen off and who were, not willing to help anymore, or were just quite frankly burned out, there was some Ron Paul folks that said, I said, hey, I voted for John McCain, you voted for Ron Paul, that's all right. You happen to be right on most of this stuff, as we now know. Come on in and help. And some of those folks were the strongest folks helping me and other people. And that's where we got to be if we want to become a majority again. If we want to actually move legislation through the state of Minnesota, we need people. I need to get to 68. We're at 47 in the Minnesota House, so we need everybody.
And I'm glad to hear at least that the Republican Party is now welcoming in the Ron Paul people. I mean, since the election, we have heard that yes, Ron Paul people are welcome. So you're here, great.
They found the Ron Paul people right underneath those principles that they just developed.
Underneath the ballots in the trunk, right?
All right, we'll go to the next audience member question.
We all know that there's a census coming up next year, which means we're going to be facing redistricting. David Simkin told me recently that 48% of the House seats are non-competitive DFL. After redistricting, we could be in the minority permanently. How is it that we can attract, pro-choice, fiscally conservative people, and the GLBT community, which in the 5th Congressional District is 144,000 strong, to vote Republican?
I tell you what, I take that question in a different direction, because we live in the same area. And it's part of the Big Ten theory. One of the more intriguing figures in our Minnesota political life to me has been Steve Swiggum, who at the age of 26 was protesting outside of Planned Parenthood, staunchly pro-life, and became a legislator and grew into the role, became Speaker of the United States, the Minnesota House. And I tell you, there was nothing more gratifying to me than watching Steve Swiggum in the heart of Kenwood, stumping for a gal named Liz Whitbeck, who ran against Dee Long, and she was pro-choice. And I think that perhaps more so than any other person in Minnesota government who preaches the unity of the team, it's Steve Swiggum. And here was a guy who got involved in politics on a social issue and found himself 20-some years later stopping for someone who disagreed with him on that issue, but believed in the fundamental free market principles we're all talking about here tonight. So I digress, but that's where I take that question. With the exception of redistricting, in 1990, I did a week ago. I did a panel with Roger Moe, and I think we all forget that in 1990, the redistricting plan, Arnie Carlson forgot to do a correct veto, and we were stuck with the DFL Dream Plan that decade. And I tell you what. So the redistricting plan took effect in '92. By 1994, House GOP candidates were getting more votes in aggregate than Democratic candidates. So I don't worry too much about the way the districts are drawn. Yes, I do, but I think that's an intriguing thing that we became the majority party in the Minnesota House under the DFL Dream Plan that Arnie Carlson screwed up.
I think that the point is that we're a very mobile society today, and that's one of the problems with central planning, whether it applies to the economy or it applies to redistricting. It's going to be good for a while, but we're a mobile society. People are going to move. The districts are going to change. I saw an article the other day on Politico talking about how the 6th district is moving away from being a solid conservative district. So the highly mobile society, if we concentrate on the message, if we concentrate on getting the activists and the grassroots enthusiasm, that to me is more important than things that, more or less we can't control.
I just don't buy the premise that X number of seats are unwinnable or solid Democrat. I mean, under that principle, we would have never taken control of the House in 1998 under the Democrat plan. And under the current plan, at one point, we had 81 seats in the legislature. I don't buy that premise. I think part of our problem, you can get into the tactics and the strategy, the mechanics of winning elections. I think we hyper-target the seats too much. We used to run, and I was executive director back when we took control of the House back in '98, and we used to run more full court press across the state. I don't mean just putting candidates in every district, but running more competitive campaigns, and we used to do more in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And instead of just putting people on the ballot, or instead of just putting them there and then saying goodbye, we'll see you later, we would actually help candidates. We actually had staff who worked with candidates who weren't targeted, believe it or not, and to help them run better, more competitive campaigns. And we need to return to do that, because if we're not putting people on the ballot, number one, if we're not running in the race, we've got to provide the infrastructure and the support for that. I mean, I don't want to make this some kind of a campaign speech, but we used to do when we target ourselves into a minority right now. So we hyper-target, and I understand our allocation of resources. But when we used to do voter ID, we used to do paid voter ID in the whole state, Minneapolis, St. Paul included. Because to us, a Republican in Northeast Minneapolis or Kenwood was just as good as a Republican in Edina or over in Washington County. And we just haven't done that lately. We need to get back to doing that, because if we start running campaigns, if we start running competitive campaigns, we will lift our Republican ticket up from the bottom, and one of these days we'll win one of these seats. And we can't keep conceding. First we concede the inner city, now we're going to have to concede the first ring suburbs, now we have to concede the second ring suburbs. How are we going to do the exurb things?
Anybody who's younger than me, the greatest gift you could give to me as a Minneapolitan is an elected person in the great city of Minneapolis.
I think Craig is right on the money. You know, we have to have a message that we can go out and we can sell in Minneapolis. You know, the free market. I mean, there are people. I think, Michael, you're talking about running. There are candidates who are gearing up to run for Minneapolis City Council, and you can't tell them that they can't win in there. And as an aside, they're Ron Paul people, so you can't tell them they can't win.
There is not a corner of this state. There's not a corner of the state or this city right here. I don't think you can be too radical on fiscal issues right now. And running as the party or the candidate of fiscal conservatism is the way to go. And whether it's right in the heart of the beast here in Minneapolis or wherever, that's going to be what helps propel us into office the next couple election cycles. Because that's what's going to do. Economics and fiscal conservatism are what's going to drive turnout for right of center, or for conservative candidates. And that's why I think, look, if we run like that in Minneapolis, we should be running for every single city council.
And sometimes I think there's hope. The greatest little Lowry Hill, Kenwood, Minneapolis secret is that all these people, and I have a dog, and we walk a lot in the neighborhood, and I know where the Wellstone signs are in the backyard, that vines growing up on the church. Well, a lot of those signs, a lot of those houses still have the Wellstone signs. Most people have gone to court and challenged their property valuations. There is a serious histicity going on in the city of Minneapolis.
Let me add one point, because this is a pet peeve of mine, so I'm going to gripe here a little bit. But when you look at the policies that we're offering here, when you look at things like school choice, when you look at things like Social Security reform, private Social Security accounts, when you look at these things, these are programs that really benefit minority people. Social Security, you know, the Democrats like to talk about the transfer of wealth. Social Security is one of the biggest transfers of wealth from poor people to rich people that there is. School choice, when you're talking about school choice, you're able to take a kid from a lower income inner city family and put them in a neighborhood school that's not a public school. This is a great benefit to people when you've got an African American community where less than 50% of the people are graduating from high school. And the problem is Republicans will not go into those neighborhoods. They will not go in on their turf and make the pitch. And that's one of the things that we have to do. We have to learn how our policies benefit minority groups and not be afraid to go out and tell that story.
And it's not just Minneapolis City Council. As I used to tell Ron Paul people, you know, what's up in your neighborhood? Dog catcher, run for it. mean, soil conservation district, run for it. Anything, run for it. I know we focus on the legislature, and that's very, very important. But so much money is spent at these local levels that, you know, we can't be ignoring those. We need to be getting on those, both from the Republican Party aspect, but just because you can carry the message of freedom, you don't have to put Republican on your forehead. And you can be spreading that message as you run, and you can win there.
And then you can run for a partisan race in the legislature. It's right message, right messenger from the right place. And I think that gets back to the point of the question, was that's how we win in areas where we're not currently winning.
Just take a couple more questions here. And you know, actually, in the Conservative Party, we're often accused of being good old boys club and not being fair to women. So if there are any ladies in the audience who have any questions, now might be a time to speak up. No? Nobody?
I'll answer it, I'm married.
Thank you, though. Okay, all right, we'll give it a Oh, I'm sorry.
The question I have is, one thing that I was really kind of outraged at, Barb Davis White ran in Minneapolis. And from several people I heard that she was told if she supported Ron Paul, she wasn't going to get any campaign money from anyone as far as the national or state party. She stood up in support of him based on her beliefs and what she thought was right. She didn't get any of that money. How do you feel about that? They had promised her quite a bit of money from what I heard, and they retracted that money. And I want to know what you think about that.
I don't know anything about it, so I can't answer your question.
I don't either. I can't speak to exactly what the party did and did not do.
I can say from having been involved in the party for a while, we used to do a lot more for the congressional candidates in general, not just Barb Davis White. We used to provide, everybody for several election cycles in a row were maxed out from the party. We used to provide a lot more support to the candidates. We used to provide a lot more training. And I know that didn't occur this time, and it should have, because people running in difficult districts like the 5th, the 4th, the 8th, actually need the help and the infrastructure the most. It's easy to run in a targeted seat or a seat where everybody's focusing the attention and the money. It's actually harder. It's in some ways more important for the party, for the movement, to make inroads in a place like this. So we definitely need to do more in the future for candidates like Barb Davis White and others who run in these difficult districts so they can run more effective campaigns.
I don't want to revise and extend my remarks. At the state convention, I think that to your point, because I kind of sympathize, I don't know the facts behind what you say, I don't know if they're true or not, I have absolutely no idea, but I do know that at the state convention, that Barb was kind of the darling of that convention when it was inside the hall, when she was introduced, when she spoke, she was hugged and she was praised, and everybody went, wow, this is what we need more of. And she was also the only person from the party of consequence who went out to the Ron Paul speech prior to the convention, got up on stage, made her remarks, introduced, I don't know if she introduced it, but she made her remarks and welcomed him. And so I do see the dichotomy there that you're driving at, that, hey, this is our black person, or this is our woman, whatever it be placed. And yet she was the only one who really went out there and, before it was popular, was pushing Ron Paul and was pushing those ideas. And maybe not even pushing those ideas so much as saying, at least let's listen to this guy. And she did apologize